Okay. Continuing on with war, chapter 25, occupy the moral high ground, the righteous strategy. When we left off here, it was Leo 10 versus Martin Luther. I'm not going to get back into that portion of it. I'm just going to jump back into the interpretation of the story of Leo 10 in the Catholic Church versus Martin Luther, an unknown German theologian who challenged the church's authority to sell indulgences into the afterlife. Interpretation. Luther's original intention in his 95 Thesis was to discuss a point of theology, the relationship or lack of it between God's forgiveness and the papal indulgences. But when he read Parius' response to his argument, something changed in him. The Pope and his men had failed to find justification for indulgences in the Bible. There was much more they could not justify as well, such as the Pope's unlimited power to excommunicate. Luther came to believe that the church needed drastic reform. Reformation, however, would require political power. If Luther simply railed at the church's wickedness from the pulpit or among his fellow priests, he would get nowhere. The Pope and his men had attacked him personally, questioning his motives. Now Luther, in turn, will go on the offensive, fighting fire with fire. Luther's strategy was to make the war public, transforming his moral cause into a political one. He did this by exploiting the previous century's advances in printing technology. His tracts, written in vigorous, angry language that appealed to the masses, were widely disseminated. He chose points of attack that would particularly outrage the German people, the Pope's decadent lifestyle, funded through the sale of indulgences, the use of the church's power to meddle in German politics, and on and on. Perhaps most devastating of all, Luther exposed the church's hypocrisies. Through these various tactics, he was able to spark and stoke a moral anger that spread like fire, forever tainting the public's vision, not of the Pope, but of the church itself. Luther knew that Leo would respond to him, not with arguments based on the Bible, but with heavy-handed force, which he also knew will only make his cause shine all the brighter. And so, with incendiary language and arguments that questioned Leo's authority, he baited the Pope into rash counterattacks. Luther already led an exemplary life, but he took it further by refusing all income from his writings. This widely known move, in effect, made his goodness theatrical, a matter for public consumption. In a few short years, Luther gained so much support among the masses of the Pope. Luther gained so much support among the masses that the Pope could not fight him without provoking a revolution. By using morality so consciously and publicly, he transformed it into a strategy for winning power. The Reformation was one of the greatest political victories in history. Understand, you cannot win wars without public and political support, but people will balk at joining your side or cause unless it seems righteous and just. And as Luther realized, presenting your cause as just takes strategy and showmanship. First, it is wise to pick a fight with the enemy that you can portray as an authoritarian. Hypocritical and power hungry. Using all available media, you strike first with a moral offensive, strong and appealing to the masses, and craft it, if you can, to give people the opportunity to express a hostility they already feel. You quote your enemy's own words back at them to make your attack seem fair, almost disinterested. You create a moral taint that sticks to them like glue. Baiting them into your heavy-handed counterattack will win you even more public support. Instead of trumpeting your own goodness, which will make you seem smug and arrogant, you show it through a contrast between their unreasonable actions and your own crusading deeds. Aim at them, the most withering charge of all, that they are after power, while you are motivated by something higher and selfless. Do not worry about the manipulations you will have to resort to if you are to win this moral battle. Making a public show that your cause is more just than the enemy's will amply distract people from the means you employ. Keys to warfare. In almost all cultures, morality, the definition of good and evil, originate as a way to differentiate one class of people from another. In ancient Greece, for example, the word for good was first associated with the nobility, a higher classes who served as the state and proved their bravery on the battlefield. The bad, the base, self-centered, and cowardly were generally the lower classes. Over time, a system of ethics evolved that served a similar but more sophisticated function: to keep society orderly by separating the antisocial and evil from the social and good. Societies use ideas about what is and what is not moral to create values that serve them well. When these values fall behind the times or otherwise cease to fit, morality slowly shifts and evolves. There are individuals and groups, however, who use morality for much different purposes, not to maintain social order, but to extract an advantage in a competitive situation, such as war, politics, or business. In their hands, morality becomes a weapon they wield to attract attention to their cause, while distracting attention from the nastier, less noble actions we all have about conflict and war. Let me back up here. In their hands, morality becomes a weapon they wield to attract attention to their cause, while distracting attention from the nastier, less noble actions inevitably in any power struggle. They tend to play on the ambivalence we all have about conflict and power, exploiting our feelings of guilt for their purposes. For instance, they may position themselves as victims of injustice so that opposing them seems wicked or insensitive. Or they may make such a show of moral superiority that we feel ashamed to disagree with them. They are masters of occupying the high ground and translating it into some kind of power or advantage. Let us call these strategists moral warriors. They are generally two types, unconscious and conscious. Unconscious moral warriors tend to be motivated by feelings of weakness. They may not be so good at the straightforward game of power, so they function by making other people feel guilty and morally inferior. An unconsciousness, reflexive way of leveling the playing field. Despite their apparent fragility, they are dangerous on an individual level, because they seem so sincere and can have great power over people's emotions. Conscious moral warriors are those who use the strategy knowingly. They are the most dangerous on a public level, where they can take the high ground by manipulating the media. Luther was a conscious moral warrior, but being also a genuine believer in the morality he preached, he used the strategy only to help him in his struggle with the Pope. Slipperier moral warriors tend to use it indiscriminately, adapting it to whatever cause they decide to take on. The way to combat moral warriors in general is indicated by certain strategies that have evolved in the modern warfare itself. The French officer and writer André Bouffray has analyzed the use of morality as a military strategy in the context of the French-Algerian Wars of the 1950s and of the Vietnam Wars fought by first France and then the United States. Both the Algerian and the North Vietnamese worked hard to frame each of their respective conflicts as a war of liberation fought by a nation struggling for its freedom against an imperialist power. Once this view was diffused in the media and accepted by many in the French and American publics, the insurgents were able to court international support, which in return serves to isolate France and the United States in the world community, appealing directly to groups within these countries that they were latently or overtly sympathetic to, or at least ambivalent about their cause. They were able to sap support from the war within. At the same time, they cleverly disguised the many national maneuvers to which they themselves resorted to fight their guerrilla wars. As a result, in the eyes of the world, they dominated the moral battlefield, enormously inhabiting France's and America's freedom of action. Stepping gingerly through a political and moral minefield, these powers could not fight their wars in a winnable manner. Bouffray calls the strategic use of morality an exterior maneuver, for it lies outside the territory being fought over and outside the battlefield strategy. It takes place in its own space, its own moral terrain. For Bouffray, both France and the United States made the mistake of ceding the high ground to the enemy. Because both countries had rich democratic traditions and saw their wars as justified, they assumed that others would perceive these struggles the same way. They saw no need to fight for the moral terrain, and that was a fatal mistake. Nations today must play the public game, deflecting their enemies' attempts to portray them as evil, without appearing to whine about what the other side is doing. They must also work to expose their enemies' hypocrisies, taking the war to the moral court themselves, fighting on an apparently moral terms. Cede the moral terrain to the other side and you will limit your freedom of action. Now, anything you might have to do that is manipulative yet necessary will feed the unjust image the enemy has publicized, and you will hesitate to take such action. This has a great relevance to all forms of conflict. When your enemies try to present themselves as more justified than you are, and therefore more moral, you must see this move for what it is, what it most often is, not a reflection of morality of right and wrong, but a clever strategy, an exterior maneuver. You can recognize an exterior maneuver in a number of ways. First, the moral attack often comes out of the left field, having nothing to do with what you imagine the conflict is about. Something you have done in a completely different arena is dredged up as a way to drain your support or inject you with guilt. Second, the attack is often ad hominem. Rational argument is met with an emotional and personal. Your character, rather than the issue you are fighting over, becomes the ground of the debate. Your motives are questioned and given the darkest turn. Once you realize you are under attack by a moral warrior using the exterior maneuver, it is vital to keep control of your emotions. If you complain or lash out angrily, you just look defensive, as if you have something to hide. The moral warrior is being strategic. The only effective response is to be strategic too. Even if you know that your cause is just, you can never assume that the public sees it the same way. Appearances and reputation rule in today's world. Letting the enemy frame these things to its liking is akin to letting it take the most favorable position on the battlefield. Once the fight for the moral terrain has begun, you must fight to occupy the high ground in the same way you would in a shooting war. Like any form of warfare, moral conflict has both offensive and defensive possibilities. When you are on the offense, you are actively working to destroy the enemy's reputation. Before and during the American Revolution, the great propagandist Samuel Adams took aim at England's reputation for being fair-minded, liberal, and civilized. It poked holes in this moral image by publicizing England's exploitation of the colonies, resources, and simultaneous exclusion of their people from the democratic processes. The colonists had a high opinion of the English, but not after Adams' relentless campaign. To succeed, Adams had to resort to exaggeration, picking out and emphasizing the cases in which the English were heavy-handed. His was not a balanced picture. He ignored the ways in which England had treated the colonies rather well. His goal was not to be fair, but to spark a war. And he knew that the colonists would not fight unless they saw the war as just and the British as evil. And working to spoil your enemy's moral reputation, do not be subtle. Make your language and distinctions of good and evil as strong as possible. Speak in terms of black and white. It is hard to get people to fight for a gray area. Revealing your opponent's hypocrisies is perhaps the most lethal of offensive weapons in the moral arsenal. People naturally hate hypocrites. This will work, however, only if the hypocrisy runs deep. It has to show up in their values. Few will care about some innocuous self-contradictory comment made or vote taken long ago. But enemies who trumpet certain values as inherent to their side, yet who do not always adhere to those values, in reality make juicy targets. The Algerian and North Vietnamese propaganda campaigns were so destructive in part because of the discrepancies they were able to show between the value of freedom and liberty espoused by France and the United States and the actions those countries were taking to squash national independence movements. Both nations seemed hypocritical. If a fight with your enemies is inevitable, always work to make them start it. In 1861, President Abraham Lincoln maneuvered carefully to make the South shoot first at Fort Sumter, initiating the Civil War. That put Lincoln on a moral high ground and won over many ambivalent Northerners to his side. Similarly, even if you are fighting a war of aggression, your goal is to take from your enemy. Find a way to present yourself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. You are fighting not for land or money, but to free people suffering under an oppressive regime. In general, in a conflict that is potentially nasty, in which you are certain the enemy will resort to almost anything, it is best that you go on the offensive with your moral campaign and not wait for their attacks. Poking holes in the other side's reputation is easier than defending your own. The more you stay on the offensive, the more you can distract the public from your own deficiencies and defaults. And faults are inevitable in war. If you are physically and militarily weaker than your enemy, all the more reason to mount an exterior maneuver. Move the battle to the moral terrain, where you can hamstring and beat the stronger foe. The best defense against moral warriors is to give them no target. Live up to your good name. Practice what you preach, at least in public. Ally yourself with the most just cause of the day. Make your opponents work so hard to undermine your reputation that they seem desperate, and their attacks blow up in their faces. If you have to do something nasty and not in harmony with your stated position or public image, use a cat's paw. Some agent to act for you and hide your own role in the action. If that is not possible, think ahead and plan a moral self-defense. At all costs, avoid action that carry the taint of hypocrisy. A stain on your moral reputation can spread like an infection. As you scramble to repair the damage, you often inadvertently publicize the doubt it has opened up, which simply makes things worse. So be prudent. The best defense against a moral attack is to have inoculate yourself against it beforehand, by recognizing where you may be vulnerable and taking preventive measures. When Julius Caesar crossed the Republican and initiated the civil war against Pompey, he was highly vulnerable to the charge of trying to usurp the authority of the Roman Senate in order to become the dictator. He inoculated himself against these charges by acting mercifully toward his enemies in Rome, making important reforms, and going to the extreme in showing his respect for the Republic. By embracing some of the principles of his enemies, he kept their attempts at moral infection from spreading. Wars are most often fought out of self-interest. A nation goes to war to protect itself against an invading or potentially dangerous enemy, or to seize a neighbor's land or resources. Morality is morality is sometimes a competent in the decision, and a holy war or crusade, for example. But even here, self-interest usually plays a role. Morality is often just a cover for the desire for mere territory, more riches, more power. During World War II, the Soviet Union became a beloved ally of the United States, playing a key role in the defeat of Hitler. But after the war, it became America's darkest enemy. American self-interest, not the Soviets, had changed. Wars of self-interest usually end when the winner's interests are satisfied. Wars of morality are often longer and bloodier. If the enemy is seen as evil, as the infidel, it must be annihilated before the war can end. Wars of morality also train up uncontrollable emotions. Luther's moral campaign against Rome generated such hatred that in the subsequent invasion of the Holy City by the troops of Charles V in 1527, German soldiers went on a 6-month rampage against the church and its officials, committing many atrocities in what came to be known as a sack of Rome. As in war, so in life, when you are involved in a conflict with another person or group, there is something you are fighting over, something each side wants. This could be money, power, and position, on and on. Your interests are at stake. There is no need to feel guilty about defending them. Such conflicts tend not to be too bloody. Most people are at least somewhat practical and see the point in preventing a war from going on too long. But those people who fight out of moral sense can sometimes be the most dangerous. They may be hungry for power and are using morality as a cover. They may be motivated by some dark or hidden grievance, but in any case, they are after more than self-interest. Even if you beat them, or at least defend yourself against them successfully, discretion here may be the better part of valor. Avoid wars of morality if you can. They are not worth the time and the dirty feelings they churn up. The reversal. A moral offense has a built-in danger. If people can tell what you are doing, your righteous stance may disgust and alienate them. Unless you are facing a vicious enemy, it is best to use this strategy with a light touch and never seem shrill. More battles are for public consumption, and you must constantly gauge their effect, lowering or raising the heat accordingly. So peace. That was chapter 25. Taking the moral high ground. Occupy the moral high ground. The righteous strategy in his book called War by Robert Greene. Come back to my channel, view some more. I'm gonna have more to read. Getting on you. You know, this is a channel, man. Niggas that read books. Trying to add some value to your life. Peace.